All right, hello, grade 11s. So we're talking about cells. We're talking about features of cells, what cells do. Yesterday we talked about how cells get nutrients. So we talked about cells that ingest things, cells that absorb things, absorption, ingestion, photosynthesis, chemosynthesis, phagocytosis. Remember the membrane pulling stuff in, rolling in on itself. Exocytosis, where it does the opposite. So these are all things that cells do. So they get these nutrients. Today we're going to talk about what do they do once they have these nutrients. What are these nutrients for? Well, the big thing is the nutrients are for energy. It's for getting energy, harnessing the energy and nutrients. And so what cells do is glucose is the main sort of the molecule of energy. That's the sugar. When you eat table sugar is a combination of glucose and fructose. And the glucose, that goes into your cells, and what happens is it undergoes metabolism. It's broken down. The bonds in the sugar molecule, the glucose molecule, are broken, and energy is released. Initially, in the cytoplasm, what happens is a process called glycolysis. And that breaks down the sugar into these 2 carbon units. We don't need to yet know what those are. We may never know in Life Sciences 11. Later, you'll get to know what it is. And this process, glycolysis, produces 2 ATP. So what is ATP? What is that word? You will hear ATP. It's adenosine triphosphate is the long name of it. And essentially what it is, it's a molecule. It looks like this. There's a picture of it. It's got like a 5 carbon sugar and a base here. But then it has, this is the special part. It has what are called these phosphate groups. And if you see here, there's a bond between these phosphate groups, and it's called a high energy bond. And when that bond is broken, it releases energy. Now, that we always say that, and it took me like 20 years to finally realize, what does that mean? It releases energy. That's such a nebulous thing. But what it means is that it just releases a little bit of heat. That's the energy that it just makes things a little bit hotter. And that heat becomes kinetic energy, becomes the molecules in the cell just move a little bit faster and can do chemical reactions. Your metabolism keeps going. That's basically all it is, just a little bit of heat. It's just to keep going, just a tiny, tiny, tiny amount of heat. But it's happening constantly all the time. All this ATP is being broken. So basically what happens is you eat the sugar and it gets turned into ATP. Now glycolysis in the cytoplasm makes 2 of these ATP from 1 molecule of sugar. You get 2 ATPs. And this is called anaerobic respiration. The whole thing, making sugar out of, so taking sugar and turning it into ATP, is called cellular respiration. And then this is anaerobic respiration. And just what it means is that you are turning sugar without the presence of oxygen. You don't need oxygen to do this. Now, eukaryotic cells, remember, we're eukaryotic cells. There's prokaryotic, eukaryotic. We talked about that. Eukaryotic cells have membrane-bound organelles, and one of the more important membrane-bound organelles is the mitochondria. Remember, I think we talked about the mitochondria somewhere in here. Mitochondria, maybe, or was that another class? But mitochondria are oh, there they are. There's some mitochondria. There we go. So we're going to talk about mitochondria now. So here's an organelle called mitochondria. It looks like that. It's got all these membranes. And on those membranes are all these proteins. Is basically an ATP making factory. And so what happens is, first you have glycolysis happen in the cytoplasm. You make 2 ATP doing glycolysis, and then you produce these 2 carbon units, and then those carbon units go into the mitochondria, and they go through the factory. All kinds of stuff happens to them, and it produces 36 more ATP just from those 2 carbon units. So in grand total, a eukaryotic cell from 1 molecule of sugar will make 38 ATP because we've got mitochondria. Now, when it goes into mitochondria and gets broken down, that process is called aerobic respiration. And it's called aerobic respiration because it needs oxygen. The oxygen has to be there because as the sugar is broken down, the presence of oxygen, it bonds hydrogens that are basically released in this process. So it basically turns into water. So you need that oxygen. That's why you breathe. That's it. You breathe so you have that oxygen, so your mitochondria and your cells can produce ATP, which then you use for energy in your cells to move and smile and talk and do all the things that you do. That's what that oxygen is for, okay? Now, so as a result, there are organisms, so prokaryotic cells that don't have mitochondria, you see they're not as efficient. There's another one of those efficiency things because from each piece of sugar, they only make 2 ATP. They don't make that other 36. They don't have mitochondria. They can't do it. So in order for them to keep going, they need to eat more sugar. We are way more efficient. 1 molecule of sugar, 1 molecule of glucose make 38 ATP. But as a result, our cells that do this, so there's mitochondria in all eukaryotic cells, even unicellular eukaryotic cells. Those, because they need oxygen to do that, are called obligate aerobes. They're obligated to get air. So we're obligate aerobes. Cells that don't do mitochondria, that don't do aerobic respiration are called obligate anaerobes. They are obligated to not have oxygen. They don't need oxygen. And then there's a certain brand of eukaryotic cells, of special cells called facultative anaerobes. And what they can do is most of the time they're aerobes, but then sometimes if there's no oxygen, they can switch to just being anaerobes. And so they just do that. It's not as efficient for them. They just produce those 2 ATP in the cytoplasm, and they're happy along. Now, funny, we have cells that do that. Our muscle cells and cells in our body do that. So when you're exercising and working out and running, and you're not getting enough oxygen, you will start to become less efficient, but your cells will become anaerobic. If you work out too hard, you'll become anaerobic. And so, and the products of that are ATP, but you also make those 2 carbon subunits that you make lactic acid. And that acid hurts. That's why you get sore muscles after you work out. It damages stuff in there. It hurts. It's why you get a stitch when you're running. It's part of it because the diaphragm in here, lactic acid is building up. But this process, so for us it's kind of bad, but for a lot of things this process is good. Yeast can be facultative anaerobes as well, and the 2 carbon unit that they produce will be an ethyl alcohol. And that's how beer is made. It's called fermentation. So we do fermentation, and yeast does fermentation. So if you starve yeast of oxygen, certain kinds of yeast, you will make alcohol. The same thing for fruit. Fruit do this as well, but those are not animal cells or fungi cells. Those are plant cells, and they make an alcohol as well. And that's how wine is made. You put in the presence of sugar and grapes, and if you bottle it up, you don't let any oxygen into the crushed fruit, it will ferment, and you will produce alcohol. So it's big business. Fermentation is big business. Facultative anaerobes are big business. Now, the thing about us, about our bodies, we don't even waste anything. So once we've made that lactic acid, it doesn't go anywhere. It stays in our cells. It gets stored up. And then once we've stopped exercising and now we're getting enough oxygen back into those cells, that lactic acid is converted back into the thing that it needs to be converted into, and then it goes into mitochondria, and 36 ATP get made from it. So we don't even waste that. That lactic acid, we still use it just later. We store it away. but it makes our muscles sore. So that's a good place to stop. So that was section B4. So you can now answer the questions on the second page of that worksheet. And there you go. That is harnessing the energy from nutrients.